Hey, welcome to this webinar. The idea is that any teacher can create a makerspace, and the goal of this webinar is that we are going to explore this idea that you can actually create a makerspace in a week. You can do it without having the fanciest of technology. You can do it when you don't have a big budget. You can do it when you have standards that you have to teach. You can do it whether or not you have gotten formal permission from a principal or not. The truth is you can design a makerspace for your students and you can knock it out in a week. So that's what we are going to be exploring in this particular webinar. Now, heads up ahead of time, I am going to share with you this Makerspace Master Course at the very end of this webinar. If you are not interested, then just listen to the practical information I'm going to be sharing and then just turn it off at that point when I get into the part where I tell you about this, this master course. But if you are interested, here's a little bit about it. This covers everything that you would want to know about getting a makerspace set up in a week. So this covers things like how do you fit it into the standards? What do you do if you don't have the best technology? What types of models exist in terms of makerspaces, and how do you work within those parameters? What are the high-tech options? What are the low-tech options? What are the blended options that meet the two of those things at the same time? And so again, it's going to be, if you don't have a big budget, if you don't have the fanciest technology, and if honestly you don't have all the skills of being someone who is a maker and has done a lot of these things like, say, circuitry or coding or whatever, that's okay. This course is for you. It's for people who want to actually make this a reality despite the constraints that they experience as teachers. So again, something I'm telling you about ahead of time. We're going to get into that a little bit more at the end, but first we're going to focus on this idea of a makerspace. And in order to do that, I want to tell you about the maker mindset first. And to do that, I'm going to tell you about my students, the ones I taught when I was an 8th grade teacher. So something about my students, I had a girl and she had published 5 novels on Wattpad. She had over 1 million page views. She was building an audience and thinking about how to launch her work to the world. And she had a maker mindset. And I tell you this because sometimes when we talk about maker spaces, maker mindsets, things like that, people automatically jump to STEM or to STEAM, or if they take the S out and rearrange the letters, they think of meat. And a meat lab would be awesome. Bacon. Anyway, she had a maker mindset, and she was a different person. She thought like an entrepreneur. She was a problem solver. She was a builder and a tinkerer. She was someone who was wildly and unabashedly different. She had a maker mindset. But that same year, I taught another student, and he was really into coding and programming and engineering. He was the first student in his class. This kid named Raul was the first one in his class, and in his family, I should say, who graduated from the 8th grade. And then he was the first one to graduate from high school. And then he was the first one to graduate from college with an engineering degree. How awesome was that? And now he's going to be the first one who has a master's degree in his family. And the coolest thing is he's the first, but he's not the only, because his younger siblings have followed in his footsteps. And not only has he made stuff, but he's made a difference. He set an example that his younger brothers and sisters are forever changed because of. And so I would argue that he had a maker mindset. But they were the outliers. They were the exceptions to the rule. I did a student survey before kids came into my class. This was 2 years ago. I wanted to see if they use their devices to consume or to create. And 158 out of 160 had watched videos with their devices. Now, I think 2 of them were lying to me because we weren't an Amish community. We were in inner city Phoenix, and every kid, no matter how much money they had a device. But anyway, 4 out of 160 had actually created and edited videos. 159 had consumed audio with their devices, but only 3 of them had actually created and edited audio, either as a podcast or music or any of that. 152 of them had consumed video games and played them on a regular basis, but none of them had actually created them with something like Scratch. The bottom line is that students aren't digital natives. They're consumer natives. And I don't blame them for this, because we live in a consumer culture. They're consumers. I would argue that being a maker is actually wildly subversive and countercultural even. But that was our reality. And yet, there's this whole thing of a maker mindset. Here's why it's so incredibly important. What happens when kids embrace design thinking, and to be honest, when they develop a maker mindset? They grow more empathetic. They learn how to design things that people will actually use. They become systems thinkers. They learn how to be hackers and rebels who can break systems at the same time. They become explorers. They're original and innovative. They're wildly and unabashedly different. They are ready for the creative economy, and they're not afraid to take creative risks. They become the ones who can think divergently, taking apart ideas, blending them together, using things in innovative ways. And in the process, they are problem solvers, and they're able to make connections between different ideas. That's who they become as people. But there's also this economic side, and I want to get into that briefly. When I was a kid, this was the model that existed. Work hard at school, and then get into college. Graduate from college, and then get into the corporate ladder. And this wasn't exciting. It wasn't empowering. It didn't really connect to student choice. But it was a formula that worked, or at least it seemed to. But things have changed. Jobs have gone overseas. Other jobs have become automated. And the corporate ladder, well, it's gone. And instead of the corporate ladder, we have a maze. And kids are going to have to navigate this complex and confusing maze. That is the reality they're going to walk into. And this means that every child must think like an entrepreneur. They have to have that maker mindset. And I would argue that the entrepreneurial mindset is all about being a self-starter, about taking initiative to create something and do something different. And it's also about being a self-manager, being willing to manage your work and engage in project management and enter into that grind that is creative work. So we have this need, right? We want kids to develop a maker mindset. We want them to be creative. We want them to become builders and tinkerers and learn how to engage in iterative thinking. We want them to develop endurance and take creative risks. We want them to be innovative and original and different. But how do we make it happen? I would argue that teachers are the ones with the power to make it happen. I want to tell you the story of when I met my hero. This was me in the 8th grade. And look at that. I was probably like, 80 pounds lighter. Who knows? I was incredibly nerdy, still am, and incredibly shy. I remember I had one friend named Matt, and I knew him from church. He was my one friend. We were 2 nerds in a pod. And I remember the day that I came to school and he was gone. And I just stood there with my tray looking out at the sea of students, hoping that someone would invite me to their table. And it didn't happen. I was alone. I was invisible. I dumped my tray out into the trash can and I hid out in the boys' bathroom, which is about the nastiest place on campus to hide out. It's like a patch of the third world in a first world school. And I was invisible. But I had this teacher, Mrs. Smoot, and she got me into the History Day project. She refused to let me be invisible. I remember it was terrifying. I would call up baseball players. I would and interview them. I learned all about Jackie Robinson, about the Negro Leagues, about the integration of baseball. It was a powerful experience, but it was also terrifying. And I remember that through it all, I became a different person because of Mrs. Smoot. It's why I became a teacher. It's shaped so much of who I am as a person, as a maker, as someone who continues to build things and design things, as someone who's an entrepreneur. I'm always making, and it's because I developed a maker mindset. And that's because of Mrs. Smoot. It's a reminder that making is magic. And it's magic because it transforms lives. These teachers, both Mrs. Smoot and Mr. Darrow, who were my History Day sponsors, they were my heroes. In fact, they still are. And she is why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because that powerful moment that I became a maker was something I never want to forget. Having project-based learning, engaging in design thinking before I even knew what the term meant, doing something meaningful, having ownership, feeling empowered, getting to make something. That was because of her. I became a different person. So I want to share 4 truths that emerge from this idea of the maker mindset and the power of teachers as the heroes who can make it happen. Number 1, simple idea. Every child is a maker. Every one of them. Gifted, special ed, ELL, quote unquote, normal, regular, whatever. Every single child is a maker. We are born naturally creative. I hate the word creative type that people use to describe people because we are all creative types, every single one of us. I love this moment of watching the Global Day of Design where we had almost 100,000 students engaged in maker projects all over the globe. It was a reminder of the power of the maker mindset. But you know who started that? You know who made it happen? It wasn't us. We set up the Global Day of Design. We put some resources out there. But you know who made this a reality? Teachers. Dedicated teachers. Ones who were willing to take creative risks and do something different and innovate and bring the maker mindset to their classroom. Number 2, I believe this truth. Every student should have access to creative projects. I remember one student who struggled with executive function, struggled with authority, struggled with finishing his work. And then we got involved in these maker projects, like building a roller coaster, building a bridge, things like that. And also things like blogging and stop motion animation. And the cool thing is I watched him develop this grit, develop this perseverance, because he defined himself as a maker. And it was powerful. And it's because I believed at the time, and I still do, that every student, every one of them, should have access to creative projects. Truth number 3, every subject should have a makerspace. I believe this to my core, that classrooms should be bastions of creativity and wonder, and that teachers are the ones who are the architects who can make this happen. I think that makerspaces can happen in social studies. This is what happened when we did our Shark Tank projects. This is what happened when we did our documentary projects. In fact, I started my first makerspace in a social studies classroom. I think it happens in science classrooms, in technology, engineering, in math, in language arts. There are so many opportunities to engage in creative work. And so every single classroom, every single subject should have a makerspace. Number 4, teachers are the architects who make this happen. They're the ones who design the spaces that allow for the maker mindset to develop. I'm going to share my story. I fell in love with this idea of makerspaces. I think the term was pretty new at the time. I didn't realize it. People were saying makerspace, they were saying STEM lab, they were saying fab lab, and they all kind of meant the same thing. It was around 2005. At the time, Make magazine was new, and we were totally geeked out on it. We thought it was awesome. And I wanted this really cool makerspace in my classroom. I had a vision for what it would look like. But then, well, I ran into a wall because this perfect vision of this perfect makerspace became, well, a dream. It was far off. It was distant. It was a utopia. What about the time constraints? I had a tight curriculum map. What about the curriculum map? Could I reorganize it somehow to allow for maker projects in a classroom makerspace? What if I don't have the most expensive fancy gadgets? And so I spent 2 years planning and designing and replanning and researching and looking things up and trying to find out what kind of grants we would need and how to do fundraising. And it was 2 solid years. Then I met my friend Javi. He was a brand new teacher. I was in my 3rd year, 4th year of teaching, somewhere around there. And he was the one who reminded me of this reality, that constraints lead to innovation, that every roadblock is simply a chance to solve a problem and to innovate. And so suddenly we looked at these limitations and we figured out how to solve problems instead. For example, I wanted standing centers, but the furniture was way too expensive to pull off. It was just going to be way too hard to actually do. So instead, we had these big, heavy metal, not like the heavy metal, but like not the music, but very heavy bookshelves that were perfect for standing by. And so we put supplies there. It became a standing center off by the side of the classroom. When I wanted brand new computers and it didn't work, we got old ones and we figured out how to run Linux on them and create a space for kids to do things online and learn how to code and all kinds of stuff like that, do blogging and multimedia. And so the lesson was that every single limitation, every single constraint actually pushed us to be more innovative as educators. So let's look back at the questions I had. What about the time constraints? We have this packed curriculum map. Well, I would argue that it's not about adding something to your plate. It's about reorganizing your plate. Are there standards that could be clustered together to be able to make a maker project happen? Are there ways that you can integrate a makerspace into what you're already doing? What about the curriculum map, right? We have to teach to this content that we have. Well, there's this whole set of things that go from loosely structured to tightly structured, from short term to long term. You can see it right there. And these are all different pedagogical structures that I used in the classroom. Genius Hour, Design Thinking, PBL, Maker Challenges, and they all fit on these different spectrums. Some of them were rapid, one-day processes. Some of them were 2 or 3 weeks. And the key thing here is that you can align it to the standards. So if you have standards that allow for multimedia creation, for example, or standards that attach to researching and citing evidence, well, those standards are present in the Common Core reading standards. There's no reason reading can't connect to making. Research is a big part of what we used in both Genius Hour and Design Thinking, and also in PBL. So suddenly I realized there was a space and a place for this making in reading, which is often not what you think of when you hear of maker spaces. You might think of STEM. I also found that there were specific standards in math that worked perfectly for maker spaces and maker projects. So the probability and stats fit in nicely to our board game project or to the proportional reasoning and budget and some of those other standards that we had to do in math fit in nicely with our tiny house project. And by the way, if you do this course, if you end up deciding that you want to do the Makerspace in a Week course, I actually have examples of both design thinking and maker challenges that you can use from day one, and I walk you through also how to attach these to the standards. There's a whole process for it. I'm not going to get into it now, but just want to say it is totally possible to have a makerspace and still teach to the standards that you have to teach. What if I don't have the most expensive gadgets? People tend to fixate on the stuff, at least I did, and that was one of my big mental barriers. But you don't have to have a 3D printer to have an awesome makerspace. There are really low-cost things you can do with Arduino, Raspberry Pi, which are essentially, in different respects, whole computers. Raspberry Pi is more like a whole computer, Arduino less so. But that are $25 to $35 a pop, not that expensive, right? You can do tons of cool stuff with circuitry that doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg. In fact, it can be really inexpensive. And those are just on the tech side, right? But on top of it, you could get computers donated, you can run Linux, like I said, and suddenly you can have a coding station that costs next to nothing for you to actually put together. And then there's things like cardboard and duct tape, which is a great way to do prototyping. You can deconstruct toys and put them back together. You can have kids designing products and using duct tape and cardboard and things like that to actually make their prototypes. You can have a really inexpensive green screen thing. And I want to point out that if you look below, I have it linked, there is the Makerspace supply list where I get into some of these different models. We explore it a little bit deeper in the Makerspace course. Again, it's something I'll talk about at the very end, but the bottom line is you don't have to have the fanciest gadgets to pull it off. Now, here's my encouragement. I want you to think about what it would mean to create your makerspace in a week. And I would call it an MVP makerspace. Now, when you hear MVP, you might be picturing something that's awesome and amazing and top shelf and all that kind of stuff. And that's because in sports we talk about MVPs, but in the development world, in the tech world, in the startup world, the MVP simply means minimal viable product. And that's actually what you want to design if you're designing a makerspace for the first time. Create that minimal viable product. And that's just the bare bones basic makerspace. And partly because you want to have something minimal because your makerspace is going to evolve as you bring more and more students into the process. As they donate things, as they find things, as they ask for things, as you figure out what they're using and what they're not using, then your makerspace becomes more and more advanced, more and more developed. But you don't have to have something that's super fancy. You don't have to have tons of supplies in the beginning. Just create the minimal viable product. And that's honestly what Javi and I did. We both in our classrooms, year one, started out with something very minimal, and then we started expanding and improving until a couple years later it was something really pretty impressive. So I want to walk you through how you would do this in a week. I think in your first day, you start with the why. You come up with your rationale for why you would want a makerspace. You also contact stakeholders if you need to. So contact your principal, contact parents, contact students if you're obviously not in school at this point. But you really start with the why and start with who you're going to contact. On top of this, you start thinking about the particular model that of makerspace that you're going to have. For example, is this going to be a shared makerspace that one grade level shares, a whole school shares this? Is this going to be a part of the library? Is this going to be an elective class or a specials class? What will the makerspace actually look like? I love the example from AJ Giuliani. He's doing these mobile makerspaces, which is basically kind of like art on a cart, but it's makerspace on a cart. And that's actually a pretty powerful way of doing it as well. Really think outside the box here. And look honestly at what you can and can't do. If you're in a subject that allows for a lot of making on a regular basis, you might want to have a full makerspace in your classroom at all times. That was the case when I taught STEM and photojournalism. At the same time, you might have, say, self-contained, like let's imagine you're a 5th grade teacher, you teach all subjects. And so your makerspace might be something that's more of a convertible approach, which means you have things that can easily be taken out and easily put back together. You have adjustable structures, you have furniture that moves around, you have wheels at the bottom of stuff, or tennis balls if your floors are flat, and no carpet. And you really start thinking about how to maneuver a makerspace with a real flexible way. And again, at this beginning stage, you're starting with the why, you're coming up with a rationale, you're figuring out your model, and you are planning it out ahead of time. This is your mile high, way above, looking at it from far, far above. Day 2 is where you're really exploring the pedagogy. You're thinking about what you can and can't do in the makerspace given your context. You're looking at how it connects to the subject. And again, like I said, I have this graph on the blog post. I also have it connected to, it's something we look in depth in our Makerspace master course. But, you're thinking about maybe using Genius Hour and taking kids to once a week to the makerspace, but maybe you're looking at something different, a design thinking plan, and so you're going to have multiple weeks in this makerspace and walking students through the entire design thinking process. Maybe they're short little maker challenges that you do in little 60 to 90 minute bursts. Maybe they're divergent thinking challenges, which is where you give kids a certain set of items and they have to make something with it really fast through rapid prototyping. The bottom line is, whatever you're choosing to do, you're thinking about how it connects to the standards. You're making sure that you're still teaching what you have to teach, right? You're being honest about it. And you're really being reflective about what type of model this connects to. If you have access to a makerspace every single day, then yeah, the long-term ones are going to make a lot of sense. If, on the other hand, you're talking about designing a school-wide makerspace in a library, you might have to do with ones that are a little bit more short-term, and that's okay. Day 3 is where you create a solid supply list. So you started with the why, you moved into the pedagogy, the real what you want kids to learn, and now you're doing this solid supply list. Again, I have the Makerspace supply list below. I'm not going to get into this too much, but your supply list doesn't have to be super fancy. You're just getting the basic supplies you want. And from there, you want to start thinking about your organizational model. Are you going to have station rotations and kids are required to do different things at different stations? Are you going to differentiate the space and say a standing area here, a sitting area here, open floor, open space area over there, a green screen area over there, a Lego area over there? I mean, how are you going to design it so either they move through stations, the space is differentiated, maybe you have a very open model where kids can move supplies back and forth and kind of mash stuff up. So you're really thinking through the organizational model, and at this point, given the organizational model, given the supplies that you have, you're starting to sketch out an initial layout. And then you spend day 5 really designing your layout. Now, in my experience, day 5 works well where you're sketching out the layout yourself, but you're also just physically maneuvering things around. Now, you want to be really safe here. You want to follow district and site safety protocols. I'm not saying that you should do this all by yourself. In fact, I think having a team working with you on designing your layout makes a lot of sense. You're taking out furniture that's not necessary. I personally found that it was helpful to ditch the kidney-shaped table in a classroom. that took up a lot of space. It was helpful to take out the teacher desk and to really have a lot of room for movement. You're thinking strategically about storage at this point. You're unfortunately going to Target and buying a few things, or Walmart, or you're repurposing containers and stuff in order to develop this layout. Day 6 is where, now that you have that in mind, you're really thinking about classroom management. There might be items that you have to think about safety issues, like maybe you have hot glue guns or X-Acto knives. Maybe you have wiring going on and electronics. And so with those things in mind, you just want to be careful about the safety side and how you're going to approach it with students. You might also want to think about how to have procedures set up so that students can be very free in the makerspace, but they can also be very safe. And you really want to think through the classroom management. You will run into people who are part of the maker culture who say things like, we don't need classroom management, kids should be free to do what they want. But you also want it to be safe. And there's nothing wrong with teaching procedures, teaching expectations, and making sure students know how to navigate this space, because it is really different for some of them. And day number 7 is where you put it all together. And I think in day number 7, it really helps to physically put it together, to have that MVP piece set up, to spend 8 to 10 hours and just knock out the physical layout of what it looks like. And then to take some time to pretend you're a student and actually do some of the making there. Sit down in some of the spaces, explore it, and pay attention to it. And so that's the basic idea of how you develop a makerspace, how you design it and put it all together within a week. Don't make the mistakes I made. These were the big mistakes I made along the way. Number 1, spending too much time thinking, reading, studying, and never actually doing the work. I spent forever trying to figure out how to do this, and I missed out on the fact that I really just needed to take the leap and jump into the makerspace and actually make it a reality. Number 2, waiting until I had the best supplies. Again, I want to point out we have this makerspace supply list, and I go through several different supplies and also ideas on how to organize it. It's broken up into price ranges and everything, and this piece is absolutely free. You can download it from my blog, and there are tons of different options in terms of what the makerspace would have. Number 3 is trying to do it all by myself. I made my biggest mistake here by simply trying to do the makerspace all by myself and work through it. And it wasn't until I collaborated with Javi and he and I worked together that we developed makerspaces in our own individual classrooms. So here's my challenge. Create a makerspace in a week. Try an MVP makerspace. This is the idea of a makerspace that costs as little as possible, that doesn't have a ton of technology or whatever, but you're designing the space and the systems so that students can help you design the rest of the makerspace. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be flashy. It just has to be a space where students can engage in meaningful creative work, where there's movement, where the storage is well done, where the layout is strategic and well planned out, and where you've kept it within this budget. And in the process, you can have something awesome. So, I want to tell you about this Makerspace Master Course. If you go to bit.ly/makerspace course or look below, you can pre-order now. The cost of the course, it takes about a week to go through. It is $125. In this course, again, we cover, I've interviewed tons of experts on makerspaces. I get into what types of activities to do in makerspaces, where to find resources, how to organize it, how to set up a budget for it. Supply lists. There's information in there in terms of how to align it to the standards, talking to administrators and getting their permission, bringing in stakeholders. We cover everything in this course, and we cover it strategically and systematically. I spent so much time, wasted time, searching through so much information, some of it good, some of it bad, wasting my time for 2 years. And what I'm saying here is I've done this legwork. I wasted the time, and I don't want you to have to waste the time. I think you can do this in a week. And so I've distilled down the best information from all the people I've interviewed, all the books I've read, all the things I've studied, and yes, the 10 plus years that I had at Makerspace in my own classroom and when I watched it evolve. I'm taking the best of that and distilling it down into something step by step and systematic. Now you still have to do the work. It's still all about you and what you can do. Because like I said, you are the hero of your classroom. You are the one who can make it happen. I also want to point out that there is a special coupon. So if you act now, you have the next 5 days to do this from the moment you watch this webinar. So in the next 5 days, if you enter the coupon code SPENCER, SPENCER, it goes from $125 down to $99. Now, one last thing that you might be interested in, there is a set of 6 bonus maker projects. Remember when I said the standards, what does it look like, what do you actually do, how do I do it without technology? These are low-tech maker projects. They are not only low-tech, they don't cost a lot of money to get the supplies. There are 2 different maker projects. One is the traditional maker project. You do it in one setting. The other is a design thinking challenge. So there's maker projects that are both the design thinking and the rapid prototyping or maker projects. So one of them can be done in 1 to 2 days. One of them takes about a week to do. And there are 6 different maker projects. Now the maker projects have all the curriculum built into it. It has the lesson plans that you can use from day 1. You can do it with your students the first week of school if you want to. It's a great team building activity that you might want to try out. There's also not only the lesson plans, there's a slideshow, there's a sketchy video I made for each one of them. So yeah, it's something you can totally use in your classroom. It's straight out of the box. You can modify it, make it your own, do your own thing, and do something awesome, because ultimately you are the one that is going to transform your classroom into a bastion of creativity and wonder.